So this is just the first in what appears to become inevitably just a long-running series of videos that are going to be documenting the absurd abuses by Washington State's Attorney General Bob Ferguson against the people of Washington State and then elsewhere, just to profit himself and his chosen insiders to the net harm, I believe, of the people who actually live in Washington State. Now, some of these stories will be about the corruption of AG Bob Ferguson, and I'll title those the Corruption Chronicles, and others are going to be discussing the victims that he's created by abusing the power of his office, and I'll title those the Tales of Tyranny. Now, both of them are going to be about Washington State Attorney General Bob Ferguson. And of course, he's seeking higher office in his current effort right now to run for governor of Washington State. And most people who have observed his just abusive tactics and self-promotion over the years, they fear, quite understandably, that he is literally the worst person in Washington State for this office right now. Now, many people fear the corruption that he brings with him into the office of governor and his weaponization of the full power of the state to destroy his political enemies and, of course, just destroy the little people of the state in his just insatiable effort to retain and promote and grow his own power base. Now, I used this image right here of Bob Ferguson's boot on the face of regular people as his dominant political ideology, and I believe that it is accurate. But let's just start down this ugly road in just the stories about the Tales of Tyranny by this guy. Now, today I'm going to discuss the failed effort by the Washington State Attorney General Bob Ferguson to destroy Value Village, which is a business of 300 thrift stores around America that had 20 stores in Washington State and resold a variety of used goods, often donated to and then purchased from local charities around the country. I mean, I remember going to this place when I was a kid. Now, AG Bob Ferguson first targeted this retail operation under the Consumer Protection Act laws of Washington State, which Ferguson has just repeatedly and endlessly weaponized just beyond all recognition. And they operate kind of as a shakedown scheme to apparently extort cash from the small businesses that he targets, and then he uses this extorted cash in a way to redistribute the proceeds and self-promotion efforts to help his political election campaigns in the future. Now, more recently, kind of A.G. Ferguson made headlines by his just weird and completely botched distribution of a $40 million settlement that he made with canned tuna and chicken suppliers from years ago. And then he sent these checks out to what he claimed was many low-income voters in Washington State, with Ferguson's name on every check and a self-promotion letter included. He even continued to use state resources and the resources of his office to send out reminder letters to those who didn't cash the checks with further self-promotion material right in the middle of his campaign for governor, and this was done just a few weeks ago. Now, part of what got statewide attention to this transparent misuse of public funds just for self-promotion and campaign assistance during his governor campaign was the incompetence of the cash distribution in the first place. Reports of thousands of checks being sent to dead people, sometimes to people who had died decades before, were widely mocked and ridiculed, deservedly so. And as always, when Ferguson screws up, he blames others. In that case, he blamed the vendor that he paid. He claims it was Experian for the botched fiasco. Now, not that Ferguson really cares. Buying votes is easier when it isn't your money, and particularly when it isn't your campaign's money. So this original lawsuit that was against Value Village stores, this was intended to intimidate the business into coughing up cash, presumably so that Ferguson could send out equivalent checks just like he did on the tuna chicken check fiasco. Now, the basis of the complaint wasn't that Value Village was harming the consumer, because they clearly weren't, but that the company was a for-profit organization that appeared to operate like a charity. How dare they? Or something kind of along those lines. I mean, Ferguson's office originally started to investigate the business, Value Village, back in 2014, just a few years after the state made the mistake of electing Bob Ferguson as Attorney General in the first place. Now, partway into this investigation, it probably became apparent to the AG staff that there was just nothing to see here, and they would have to stretch to make up some kind of imaginary crime. So rather than go away, just like any good organized crime operation, they decided to try to shake down the Value Village company with a settlement of millions of dollars for the cost and privilege of a failed AG investigation. When that company refused to be extorted by A.G. Ferguson, he then took him to court, of course, in an even more costly litigation to over 8 years. And Ferguson, as is his habit, continually put out fake press releases claiming great success in his litigation effort to rid Washington State of a business that resells used products at cheap prices and pays millions of dollars to nonprofits to help keep massive quantities of used and still useful products out of landfills. That's a high priority for Ferguson. And yes, this idiotic lawsuit was every bit as absurd as it sounds. Even Washington State Supreme Court, which typically just rubber stamps the AG's shakedown operations, even they rejected Bob Ferguson unanimously last year. Now, unlike most of A.G. Ferguson's frivolous shakedown litigations, this one resulted in a successful outcome for Value Village. Unanimous decision by the Supreme Court. That's highly unusual. And, of course, Value Village clearly and unambiguously prevailed in court, and the state was actually forced to repay the abused defendants, Value Village themselves, over $4 million just in legal settlements for this frivolous and entirely avoidable campaign cash and self-promotion, shakedown and lawsuit by Bob Ferguson. Now, there's a quote that I particularly appreciate from Value Village's chief legal counsel, Rich Medway, it was last year, is quoted by the AP. And his quote is, "It's hard to understand, with a business model like ours that is so positive, why the Attorney General decided to pursue this for 8 years," he said. And then he went on to say, "It's a model that should be celebrated." And he's right, it should be. But at every stage of this costly and lengthy investigation and litigation scheme, just this whole shakedown operation, AG Bob Ferguson had every opportunity to walk away and just let the thrift store survive. But his abusive legal tactics were so ingrained into his persona and the culture that he's created at the AG's office that they just relentlessly pursued and harassed this business until the courts, the Supreme Court, finally ruled against the AG and put an end to it. Now, I first heard about this case back in 2020, just before the COVID lockdown drama completely hit our state. And while I never spoke to the defendants, I had lengthy conversations with some of their neighbors and friends who were following the case very closely. And like most of the examples of prosecutorial abuse, this case was repeatedly fraught with just excessive motion practice, very abusive legal strategies, and legal games that were endlessly played repeatedly by the AG's office at Ferguson's instructions to just run out the clock and financially ruin the business. Nothing else. That was the entire game here. Now, fortunately, in this case, the Value Village defendants prevailed. They were uniquely able to spend millions and millions of dollars in legal fees on just an army of top-shelf attorneys, and they endured the blizzard of fake news press releases by the AG's office that were put out continuously over the years. Now, absurdly, the AG's office claimed in the end that the millions of dollars in settlement costs that they were forced to fork out just a few months ago to the Value Village people just to repay some of their legal costs wouldn't actually cost the taxpayers a dime. Now, why do they say this? Because with all the shakedown operations the AG's office has been running, they claim to have a cash stash that was ready for payouts with adverse legal actions. Now, this slush fund apparently is viewed as Ferguson's personal stash of cash to pay for the victims of his abuse when they're against the odds, and only if they are wealthy actually prevail against his shakedown schemes. Now, very few people, unfortunately, are that fortunate or wealthy to be able to withstand the abuse that AG Bob Ferguson directs at them. Now, there are fewer Value Village thrift stores in Washington State today than there were when Bob Ferguson's shakedown began. Massive resources of the state were wasted on a trivial and frivolous legal torture session, which would never have resulted in any positive outcome for the consumers of Washington State or the people who live here, even if he had prevailed. The poor decision-making process behind this litigation, like so many other lawsuits, they fit a pattern of behavior, and we're going to explore many of these in our future stories. Now, Value Village and the people who work for them and the customers who shop there, they managed to survive Ferguson's assault and legal shakedown efforts, but most people do not. We'll get into some of those stories and some of those examples soon. Now, I hope you share the story and the many others that will follow, because there's others in our state of Washington who have been abused. Real people need to understand the damage that bad people in public office can do when they have power. Only by sharing the truth can we help educate others who may be unaware of the dangers looming in our political class, especially from this guy. And Bob Ferguson's abuses are significant, and they should be scary to anybody who cares or thinks about these issues. We can only avoid more abuses in the future by not electing abusers like Bob Ferguson in the first place. And now that you know, please feel free to share this with others, because ignorance about these politicians is not going to save us. We have to share the truth about them far and wide to protect our family, our community, and ourselves from the abuses that Bob Ferguson inevitably plans to inflict on us all if he happens to get into the governor's mansion. This is part of what showing up looks like. Share the truth with others so that they know as well. Because, in the end, the future belongs to those who show up.